night. We take a look at things and make sure we're all happy, because it looks like we are now live. Excellent. So welcome everyone to another World Building Wednesday. Starting a little late today, actually half an hour late. Apologies for that, I was held up at work. But we're going to do World Building Wednesday anyway. And today we're going to talk about entertainment. So for those of you who haven't been here in a while, or haven't seen these videos before rather, World Building Wednesday is where I talk about some aspect of building a world, whether it be for a book, a video game, a comic, whatever you're doing it for. And we've covered a lot of different elements of world building. Today we're talking about something a little more advanced, namely the entertainments available in your world. Now, I'm actually going to talk about literacy later, which is actually an important precursor to entertainment in some ways, but I think we can safely cover entertainment at least at some level without getting into literacy. I think they are related, but not directly related. So let's talk about that. We've got a bunch of different concepts here, so we're going to add a section about entertainment. Now, when I'm thinking up entertainment, one way I like to do that is by looking for extremes. So what are the entertainments in your world that people are shocked at or are done very infrequently? And maybe might be expensive, might be difficult to do. So, for example, the gladiatorial games in Rome, while not necessarily, exotic in the sense that they happened fairly frequently, very few people were actually, involved in that entertainment, right? Crowds would show up, but it's not like many people were volunteering to be gladiators in the arena. So it was an extreme sport in that sense, or an extreme entertainment in that sense. In the modern world, we have extreme sports, although those have been made much more mainstream. But you think skydiving as being a fairly unusual entertainment, fairly remarkable entertainment. So it's kind of an interesting way of starting. I also look for vices. So things that are fun but not necessarily good for you, but aren't extreme. So smoking, not necessarily an entertainment, but so let's talk more like taking drugs, right? Certainly in entertainment, generally speaking, folks get into taking drugs for the experience of having that trip, and so it's an entertaining thing, right? And it can be a minor vice or a major vice. So that's kind of some good places to start there. It's also helpful to look at entertainment varies by class, right? The rich can afford entertainments that the poor cannot, although sometimes that causes the poor to want that a lot, or to seek a version of that, a less expensive version of that. So, the rich might be taking cocaine while the poor are sniffing glue, roughly speaking. Those are vice versions, obviously, but you might say a horse racing versus cockfighting, right? Horse racing is expensive, cockfighting is very cheap. So these are all different options for things. It'll also depend on what is considered appropriate by class, right? So those who are more high class, so to speak, might find some entertainments beneath them, but that can also factor into their desirability, right? So something that the common people do that the high class do not might then attract somebody who is high class, who gets a thrill out of it precisely because it is beneath their station, right? So as an example, not to get too prurient, but often in the past, high-class people would consort with low-class ladies of the evening, specifically for the thrill of, spending time with somebody from the lower classes in such an intimate way, in such a way that is so improper. So there can be that kind of thrill of doing something beyond one's class. Okay. Expense, thrill of indulging one's self outside of class norms. Right. Oneself. No. Let's do oneself. Oops. I do have this. Oh, that works. I do have this unfortunate tendency that I need everything to be spelled right as I'm writing it, and that sometimes blocks my ability to think. Hey, Game Escape. So, all things to worry about. I have no idea who Bob Kraft is. Sorry. So, these are all things to think about in terms of your entertainment. And it can also help to think of look for real world equivalents. So if you're stuck for entertainments, think of the kind of entertainments that we actually have in the real world. Sports, games, drugs and liquor, betting, that kind of stuff. And find an appropriate variation on those things for your world, right? Those can feel dull unless you think of an appropriate real-world version of it. So one thing people often do is that they will say, and this gets more into like Vice, but, so example, card games. They will say that the people of my world play Catarl, which is a card game in which you bet money or chips on the outcomes of various hands of cards. And each person gets dealt a couple of cards, and you bet money on that, and it goes around in rounds, and people go out, and you realize it's basically poker. You just have a different name for it, and maybe you come up with different suits and so forth, but it's basically poker. The problem with that is gotcha. Had no idea. So yeah, there's a lot of and see, world building is relevant to our real lives, right? Because the news now enters into things. Anyway, so the problem with that is that poker evolved for very specific reasons in our society, and so having the exact same structure in another world feels artificial. Now, a gambling game with cards is absolutely appropriate, but it's a little cheap to just copy pretty much all of the aspects of an existing entertainment and just change the names, right? So you got to think a little bit more about that thing, otherwise it feels kind of fakey, to be honest. You got to be careful of that stuff. So these are things to think about. So let's go ahead and apply these to our worlds. Our first setting is the post-apocalyptic verdant utopia. So this is our world of caravans, people traveling around in caravans in this jungle environment full of vegetation that can be pretty hostile to life, certainly intelligent life in certain areas, because it is after some great civilization. They're living in the ruins of some great civilization. So these tracks go between the ruins of cities that are overgrown now with vines, but the vegetation is so ubiquitous and so strong that the few remaining humans can live very luxuriously from a subsistence perspective, right? As long as you have your caravan and your stuff, there's just fruit and vegetables everywhere. You can just pick up off of trees and such as you go, and it's created this kind of easy life in that sense. That's a cool one. Plentiful food, migrant people. So we're going to go back through some of the things on this to remind ourselves. So food is plentiful, which means that food will be a factor in entertainment, because folks will probably use that as supplies for entertainment, right? You can juggle apples because there are apples everywhere. Magic is more like hedge magic. Private property rigorously enforced with personal marks. So there might be something around there. Land is pretty easy to live in. Again, migrant people. Migrant people implies a lot of travel entertainment. So not a lot of like stadiums, for example. They only have a few of those as special things, but folks generally aren't all going to gather in one place for an event. So you want more things like telling stories or playing card games and such, as opposed to destination entertainment, right? Religion, again, less impactful on entertainment. Certainly there, but not a big deal. Children, so let's see, children are very special. Childhood is a time of innocence, like a Victorian view of children. Children start getting jobs fairly early. A lot of communal clothing that's passed on to younger children. Moderate to minimal amounts of clothing, mostly to differentiate caravans. Yeah, so not a lot of clothing, but a general nudity taboo. A lot of tattoos. Profane to bring up the gods in casual conversation. We probably want more taboos, but they might evolve more out of whatever story or world we create out of this. Yeah, let's not get into sex right yet. Justice, same thing, not really entertainment related. Sticks and wooden discs used for money. So we can imagine a lot of entertainments based around that. Betting. Because this is a migrant culture, and because there's a lot of this verdant land, there's not a lot of money, I imagine, not a lot of money exchange. So you'll have betting, but it's not going to be quite the same. Religion. Drugs are increasing, so there's a thing. So let's add that before we go any further. Let's see here. Entertainments. We'll come up with a good title for that. But drugs are an increasingly popular form of relaxation. Oops. Relaxation. During caravan trips, people often play card games. This is not a civilization where I imagine printing cards is easy. There's not going to be a lot of paper because that requires an industrial civilization. So we'll say like stick games, simple board games, and such. So when I say stick games, I mean games where you are using counters and otherwise using essentially something where you can trade things back and forth to keep track of things without needing like a board with markers that can go all over the place and can fly around as a caravan is bouncing around. Or it could be a game of skill, right, where you're flipping sticks back and forth. That's the kind of thing I'm thinking of. Let's see what else. I also need to resize this. 1 second. There we go. Cool. What else are we going to have? We're going to have bouts of strength. When caravans stop, the inhabitants often engage in sports of strength, and when multiple caravans gather, there are often they usually put on a mini Olympics. And because we talked about nudity and clothing, rather, with various competitions, competitors compete in loincloths. That makes sense, right? Folks generally cover the groin, so you'd wear something. I imagine kind of like what a sumo wrestler wears. What is that actually? Sumo wrestler garment. Mawashi. Like the mawashi, worn by sumo wrestlers. So enough to cover, but a very functional sort of garment for engaging in these things. And we'll just say, and women typically bind their breasts with strips of cloth. You don't want those bouncing around, right? I've not seen Gundam NT yet, no. I want to, but I haven't gotten there yet. Watching other things. So you have that, wrestling and strength, wrestling, stone throwing, etc. Okay, so people like those sorts of physical activities. Let's see, what else? Yeah, there's games. Again, we don't know what literacy is like in this world yet, but I'm assuming it's fairly low, without printing presses. So, would we have gladiatorial combat fights? Would people go from place to place challenging each other or challenging folks in the caravan? It doesn't quite feel right. I think divination is going to be a big thing. People often engage in divination. Many recognizing that this is a superstition, and primarily entertainment. They use a wide variety of materials for this, from throwing sticks into a river and seeing how they spin, to do you want animal sacrifices? I think so. Well, we'll say scattering bones, to scattering holy water, and interpreting its pattern, to what's a more extreme version of divination. I mean, you have obviously disemboweling things, but that's a bit beyond what they're really doing, I think. You need something really big and crazy. To, well, we'll say long rituals at holy places that can get pretty crazy. I'll just write that down. So it could be, you have to dance for 5 hours straight, and let loose some of your blood, and lick a toad, and whatever. There's these really complicated rituals that people do at various sites to sort of divine and see what happens in the future. But that's, again, sort of the extreme end of things. While the average person might do the equivalent of interpreting tea leaves, right? And recognizing that they're kind of guessing, that they're doing it for play, just to see if they can think, or to see if they can identify a pattern, but not really expecting to divine the future. Okay, I like that. So we have this again. We have all of these abandoned cities. What entertainments? Racing obviously makes sense, but it's hard for caravans to do races outside of this sort of Olympic style competition. Plays. Would you have people putting on plays of things? Again, it seems hard in these small groups to do so. Oh, tell what we'll do. History is usually passed down in the form of plays put on by the members of the caravan. Instead of telling stories, those historical events instead of relating history as oral stories, historical events are related as plays put on by members of the caravan. These plays are rarely elaborate, but it would feel weird to describe a historical event instead of playing it out. That's a neat kind of historical twist, or a neat sort of a cultural twist where history is passed on by like acting it out. And this person did this, this person did that, and we all remember what these people did, and we do it normally in a somewhat formal manner, right? If we want to pass on the story, we do this. So we'll say, when a caravan stops in a place for at least a day, they typically put on a historical play. At dusk the first day. I like that. All right, moving on to setting 2, the communist ranches. So we have a civilization where gunpowder is becoming more and more common. It's our island nation, so there's one big central island, and then a bunch of small islands around it that are sort of nations. Ranching is the default method for food, so most people grow up on ranches. With very communal property. Families live very close in these small groups within these large houses, large ranch houses. Children live there until they reach a certain age, and they get their own bedroom. And you shuffle bedrooms quite a lot. Magic is rare, powerful, erratic, and requires a familiar. So here's where we're going to have traveling entertainers, especially spellcasters. Let's start there. That's going to be awesome. Entertainment. Mages often travel from community to community, putting on shows of spectacular magical effects with their familiars. Mages, though mages are generally distrusted, those who travel and entertain are treated better than the average mage. You get the idea. Let's see. So that's cool. There are also traveling bands of entertainers who put on plays, juggle, etc. more like a mini circus. And that gets into this idea of these various kind of job clans, job guilds, where there's a guild of entertainers, and their job is to travel around and entertain people. So what other kinds of things we have we have more of a world now. I'm sorry, more of a technological world here. So card games are very popular. Yeah, I assume we have printing presses, so we have cards, and card games make a lot of sense on ranches because you have a lot of time when you're just kind of looking over flocks, making sure nobody's running away, things along those lines, maybe moving things from pen to pen, but there's not, you don't have to be quite as active, so you can get in a few games of cards. Books. Do we have popular entertainment in the form of books? Are books cheap enough that people can consume books frequently? Not that has to be the only thing. So you can have a culture where books are expensive, but they are bought communally. I like that. Every ranch has a library because books are expensive but are owned by the ranch, which can spread out the cost, if you will. That's nice. I'm trying to figure out how much literature there is as entertainment as opposed to like nonfiction stuff that's practical. So we'll say about 3/4 of any given library is devoted to practical nonfiction volumes, nonfiction books about animal husbandry, and such. The other quarter, most are, we'll say, literary classics. Well, yeah, most literary classics, while the rest are popular works of fiction. Fiction typically read by younger readers. So you're basically your young adult novels. So I'm imagining you have, basically your practical books. Then you have your books that are, Wagner's The Ring Saga. Your Paradise Lost. Your really important things, which may be entertaining, and will be entertaining. And they're meant to be entertainments, but have strong literary merit, or well considered that way. And then you have your sort of trashy, adventure fiction and romance fiction and so forth. And those are generally read by the young teenagers, early adult kind of population. But on the smaller islands, on the main island, popular entertainment, popular fiction is widespread and outnumbers, what do we call it, classics by a wide margin. In other words, in order to have popular works of fiction, you need a broad base of fiction that people are consuming so as to choose which ones are popular, right? You can't have popularity without having things that are unpopular, and generally more things unpopular than there are popular. So that's where the That's the source for popularity. The main island is where people are constantly, reading and creating and consuming all these books, reading all these books, writing all these books, and then the ones that kind of bubble up to the top are the ones that spread out to the other islands and become more common out there. So I like that. That might also be true. This is also true to a lesser extent on islands adjacent to the main island. So maybe there's this idea that as you get further from the main island, libraries get smaller and more practical and more just less about fun adventure stories, whereas near the center where things are more you have more technology basically because that's where all the metal is coming from. You have this popular fiction idea. Plays. Do we have plays? We certainly have traveling bands of entertainers. We do have sort of definitely a sedentary culture, not a sedentary, but a static culture. So they live in one place. So you could have, but they're kind of stay where they are. So again, you're not going to have gladiatorial events because folks aren't as mobile. They're kind of tied to their ranch. So I think it's not going to be as big of a deal here. Except maybe on the main island. So we'll say the main island features gladiatorial fights and animal races. And even animal fights that would be considered shocking on any of the other islands. Cool. So there's sort of den of iniquity there. Did we talk about urban spices, medicines, trade goods, ships? A lot of sailing. It makes sense. But where again you get a lot of card play and things like that. Crime walkabouts, money makers, metal coins and bars. So that implies gambling. We're gonna say I'm gonna put this on top. Gambling is ubiquitous and nowhere considered a sin. Everybody gambles though many do not gamble for significant sums. People gamble on people typically gamble on animal races, human contests, wrestling, etc. And even silly bets. Will that cloud get over to that part of the sky in 10 minutes? I'll bet you a coin. Cool. Every seaport has at least one major gambling den with games of chance. Games of chance. And with well-known games of chance. And some feature more exotic and dangerous games. Yeah. So you've got the, I have a knife and I'm going to throw it at somebody, and you can bet where it lands, so to speak. Not on the person necessarily, but am I going to hit them or not, right? So, interesting. How close am I going to get to their arm? Kind of a thing. All right, cool. So we've been going about 35 minutes. We've covered a lot of entertainments. I think this is a pretty useful set. Again, as I almost always say, we'll probably add more to this as we flesh out this world. We can always come back and add more entertainments. But I think this gives us a significant flavor of each world, where the ranching world is a little more exotic, a little more dangerous. Folks are doing more gambling. You have these traveling bands of entertainers, a lot of card games in odd moments, and these libraries, every ranch having its library that people use. And then in the other setting, more drugs, simple games, but a lot of these games of strength and competition. So, and a lot of games of chance in this world. But there's divination. People like to engage in divination and see what happens with historical events related to its plays. Cool. That works. So that is this edition of World Building Wednesday. Next time I'm going to talk about literacy, as I mentioned, and how that impacts a world and a group of people. And that'll be that. So thank you all for watching, and see you next time.